Chapter 26 The Weapon. Morning came. Doon got up. He had to be ready for anything, so he rolled up his blankets and made a pack for all of his clothes, everything he had. His father and others did the same. Downstairs, out in front of the hotel, the people of Amber were gathering and swarming about, loud and distressed and confused. Tick roamed among them, urging courage, inspiring them to stand up for their rights, telling them the time had come for battle. His eyes flashed with a cold light. His voice rang out like the high, urgent tone of a bell. Very often the people he spoke to seemed to catch fire from his words and be filled with the burning desire to fight. Over half of the people of Amber joined with Tick to be warriors. Some of them had wrenched the towel rags from their bathroom walls. Others grabbed rocks or branches to use as weapons. They started down the road to the village, and the rest of the Amberites followed in confused mass. Doon went too. The morning sun, already hot, blazed down on him. Wind riffled his hair and his shirt. His mind was in turmoil, his heart thudding like a fist in his chest. Tick and his warriors carrying their towel rags, their sink pipes, their shards of glass, strode along, roaring their battle cry. "We will not go, we will not go." More and more people picked up the chant as they came into the streets of the village, and the door and windows faces appeared, shocked faces, and people still in their nightgowns. They shouted to each other, "Look, the cave people are coming, they're coming into town." Other windows flew open and doors, and people stepped into the streets, unsure whether to be angry or afraid. All the people of Amber had come. No one stayed behind to wait for the trucks that would take them out into the empty lands. All of them had to know what was going to happen. They had to be there, whatever it was. They poured into the plaza and stood packed together, the warriors roaring and the others nervous, some of them half hiding in doorways or behind trees, afraid of what was going to happen, not sure if they wanted to be part of it or not. Tick roared out his challenge. "People of Sparks, we refuse to leave. We are here to make our demands. And if you will not meet them, we will fight. We will fight," roared the warriors. Others looked at each other fearfully. Will we? From a side street, Ben Barlow appeared running. He bounded up onto his step of the town hall, faced the crowd, and yelled back, "What are you doing here? This is an outrage. This is unacceptable. You are leaving today, leaving here for good." "We will not go," screamed the crowd. "Wilmer, Mary," shouted Ben. The other two leaders followed him up onto the steps. "Clear out now," they shouted. "Back to the hotel. Move back, move back." They stood in front of the crowd and tried to press them backward, but it was no use. There were simply too many Amberites. Ben darted at Tick and tried to grab him, but Tick struck him with his rod, and he lurched sideways, clutching his arm. No one had expected the Amberites to have weapons. Doon was standing on the river side of the plaza, slightly apart from the main crowd. He had the feeling things were right on the edge of chaos, right on the edge between being in control and being out of control. It was frightening, the yelling, the waving of weapons, the people of Amber filling the plaza, and the people of Sparks crowding in around the edges, their faces full of rage and fear. "Maybe, though, Doon, the leaders will be willing to discuss our demands. Maybe we can talk and everything will be all right." It was the only ray of hope he could see. "These are our demands," cried Tick. "Listen carefully." But Ben just screamed back, "We've heard enough from you. We're finished talking to you. No more talking, no more demands." When he heard that, Doon felt a jolt of fury. It launched him into action. He sprang up onto the bench next to him and shouted at the top of his lungs at Ben, "At least listen." That drew the attention of Sugar, who was standing near him. He lunged at Doon, but Doon leaped away. He heard Ben's voice shout, "Catch that boy!" Angry faces turned towards him. Arms reached to grab him. He ducked and swerved and wove his way along the edge of the crowd, and as soon as he was in the clear, he ran. But he didn't go far. He had to stay close to the plaza. He had to know what was going to happen. He ran up the river and road and darted behind the town hall, where a few garbage barrels stood by the back door. He paused for a moment. Was anyone following him? From the plaza came a roar, and then a voice shouted, What was happening? Doon had to know. He pushed against the town hall's back door. It opened easily, and he slipped inside. A hallway led towards the front of the building. On his right was a flight of stairs. Surely, he thought. No one was in here. They were all outside dealing with the army of Embrice. He ran up the stairs, and at the top he found himself in the tower room. It was a square room with windows on all sides. A table stood in the middle with straight back chairs around it. Down below was a plaza swarming with people. The noise was like the roar of water. Tick was at the front of the crowd. Doon could see the top of his head like a shiny black stone, and his steel rod glinting in the sun. Straight below were the steps of the town hall and the tops of the heads of the 3 leaders. To his right, the windows were partially blocked by the branches of the great pine tree that stood next to the town hall. When he looked out the window toward the rear of the building, he saw the town hall roof below. This was perfect. He could see what was going to happen. He could hear, too, because the windows were open, and he realized if he stayed here, he wouldn't have to decide whether he was going to fight or not. This seemed a bit like cheating, but it was a relief, too. The thought of taking part in a bloody brawl had filled him with dread. Standing to the side of the front window, Doon looked down. Right below him was Ben Barlow. He could see the wiry gray hair on top of his head, and his hands waving furiously in the air. Mary Waters and Wilmer Dent had stepped up behind Ben. Mary tried to take him by the arm, but he shook her off. He made his hands into a megaphone for his mouth. "We will not be threatened," he shouted. "We are in charge of this town. It is our place. We built it. We own it." He yelled so loudly that his voice rasped and cracked. "You are destroying our way of life. You must go." The crowd rumbled. They pressed forward. Clouds came over the sun, and a vast shadow swept across the plaza. "You may try to make us leave," shouted Tick, "but we are here to stay." The air seemed to quiver with rage, or was it just the wind? Everything was moving. The clouds raced overhead. The branches of the trees thrashed. The Embrice raised their motley weapons. Up on the roof of the tower, the flag of sparks whipped and snapped on its pole. Doon could hear it, though he could not see it. He felt the wind swirling through his mind as well. His father's words came back to him. When the fight is over, what do we have? A place destroyed, people who hate each other. Standing above it all in the tower, he had the strange feeling of being separate, belonging neither to one side of the fight nor the other. Whose side was he on? Not on Ben's, certainly, but not on Tick's either. With his warriors calling out threats, eager for a fight, Ben held up his hand and shouted again, "We warned you, and we're ready for you." His voice was hoarse. "I'll give you one last chance. Will you leave or not?" With his head thrust forward and his hands tightened into a fist, he waited for an answer. "No!" screamed Tick. His army bellowed it out with him. "No, never, no, no." Ben dashed to the door of the town hall. Wilmer went with him, and together they darted inside. Doon froze, afraid they might climb up to the tower. But they came out onto the steps again right away, pulling a thing of black metal they ran on wheels. For a moment, the clamor of the crowd ceased as they craned their necks, trying to see over each other's head. Doon had a good view of where he stood, but still he had no idea what the thing was. He knew it must be the weapon, but it looked almost like a great black insect. It stood on black iron legs. It had a complicated black iron body nearly as long as a truck, studded with hooks and boxes and points. A narrow scarf of rich metal hung across it. It was ugly, Doon thought, like the skeleton of a monster. Ben turned the thing so that it pointed out over the crowd. He stood behind it, his feet planted wide apart. "This is your last chance," he shouted at the crowd. "Disperse or take the consequences." Mary Waters dashed towards him. "No, Ben," she cried. We can't do this." Ben pushed her away. "We agreed," he cried. "Stand back, Mary." Now that the crowd in the plaza sensed danger and began to push backward, Tick cried, "Stand your ground." But Doon saw him take a step back, too. Ben squatted at the rear end of the weapon. "Leave now and take your gang of hoodlums with you," he shouted, "or I fire." "Fire?" thought Doon. What does that mean? What does he mean? It was clear that Tick didn't know either. "You have one weapon," he shouted, "but we have many, and he raised his rod at his hand and in his hand, and behind him his warriors did the same. Ben gave a furious shout. He was crouched over the weapon. Doon saw him bend back and his arm jerking at the machine. Nothing happened. His arms jerked again harder, and at the same time Mary rushed forward. She aimed a powerful kick at the nose of the weapon, bumping it upward, and the weapon, in a harsh machine voice, began to chatter. It went, turning its snout back and forth. People in the crowd began to scream. Doon couldn't see at first what the weapon was doing. What was the point of its loud, furious shuddering? The noise was horrible, but the weapon was staying in one place, not flying out into the crowd. Was it shooting something out of it? Yes, across the plaza, over the heads of the people. Doon saw a line of holes punching into the wall, splintering a window. But the weapon suddenly stopped its clattering. Doon looked down and saw Ben give it a furious shake and shake it again, pounding on its nose to aim it lower, as the crowd yelled in panic and screamed backwards, and Mary shouted and tried to rush towards Ben, but Wilmer grabbed her arm, and then the weapon exploded. No chattering this time, just a spurt of fire that shot from the weapon's rear end, knocked Ben flat on his back and toppled the weapon forward so that it stood on its nose. This made the fire shoot straight upward, a column of bright orange chattering sparks, and reaching toward the branch of the pine tree that hung over the town hall steps. From this place in the tower, Doon watched horrified. Where was his father in the frenzied crowd? Where was Lena? Below him, the pine tree was on fire. The building would be on fire, too, in a minute, because the tree stood right up against it. Smoke was already curling through the windows. He had to get out, and that was when he heard a scream, not from the plaza below, but from somewhere above him. A bird? An animal in the pine tree? A second later, an echoing scream arose from the crowd. Doon heard someone cry, "The tree! Up in the tree! Someone's there!" Doon was at the door, ready to flee down the stairs, but he heard the scream again, and it sounded close. He darted back into the tower room and ran to the window that faced the tree. The lower branches of the pine tree were a mass of flame. He could hear the rush and roar of the fire raced among the dry needles. When he turned his gaze upward, he saw what the scream was about. A boy clinging to the branch a little higher up than the tower roof, hugging the trunk of the tree and screaming in terror as the fire swept upward. Kenny, Doon thought, was it? He couldn't tell for sure, but he knew he could leave him there. Maybe somehow he could get him in through the window. He opened it as far as he could. It was the kind of window that swung outward in the hinges. And then he grabbed one of the chairs from around the table, holding it by its back. He thrust it out the window as far as he could. "Climb down," he shouted to the boy in the tree. "Climb down quick." The boy saw him, and with a start, Doon realized who he was. It wasn't Kenny at all. It was Torrin, the one who had started so much trouble, the one who had pointed a lying finger at Doon. For one furious second, Doon felt the urge to leave Torrin to his fate and get himself out of the tower as fast as he could. But he pushed that thought away and shouted louder, "Hurry, get down here." Torrin clambered down through the branches, down toward the flames beneath him. When he was opposite the tower window, he was still too far away to reach the legs of the chair. He edged out along a branch, but it was a slender branch and bent under his weight. "Jump," Doon yelled. "Jump and catch the chair legs. I'll pull you in." Torrin crawled backward to where the branch was sturdier. He stood up, then he froze. He stood clutching the tree trunk, staring down at the flames, his mouth a dark O. "Jump," screamed Doon again. Smoke was pouring into the tower room now. "Hurry, you can do it." A gust of wind, the flames leaped. Now the branches just below Torrin's feet were blazing, and suddenly he made up his mind. Doon could see the moment of decision in his face. He clamped his lips tight. He fastened his gaze to the chair dangling out the window. And then he pushed himself away from the trunk with his hands and flung himself towards the tower. His hands caught the rung between the chair's legs, and Doon's whole body was yanked forward. He almost lost his grip on the chair, but not quite. "Hang on," he yelled. With all his strength, he hauled the chair upward, and when Torrin's hands were within reach, he grabbed one of them, and then both of them, letting the chair topple back into the room. One last heave, and Torrin was in the tower room, shaking so violently he could hardly stand. "Now," said Doon, "let's go." He headed for the door. Over the sill of the window Torrin had just come through crept a row of flames like sharp orange claws.